I'm sure by now most of you are familiar with Decware as a company that makes tube amps. Thanks to Steve Guttenberg and Andrew Robinson's rave review of the Decware amps, last I checked, the waiting list to get one is over 1,500 people. Now this reminds me of my vacation trip to Hong Kong a few years ago. Usually I plan where I go to eat because I travel to eat. But one day I ended up at this mall by accident and I had no idea which restaurant to choose. But I told my wife, don't worry, just look at which restaurant had the longest line and for sure the food will be good. Make sense? Now, a few months ago, my audio buddy Mark bought the 2.3 watt Decware Zen Trio SE84 UFO2 Class A single-ended tube amp. Man, that sounds like a product from Area 51, UFO2. Anyways, I made a video on it, and in the video, I snuck in a message pleading to Decware to send me one of their higher-end models. Maybe the audio gods took pity on me and my prayers were answered. Steve at Decware saw my video and said, "Alright Thomas, let me send you our new upcoming Tori MK5 tube power amp." Man, if only the audio gods would do the same when I buy a lottery ticket. The unit came in a nice suitcase and I unboxed it right away. Powered it up and then I was like, I might like the little small Decware UFO2 a bit more. This Tori has a different sound and I was hoping to get basically a UFO2 with more power because I love the UFO2 sweetness. So I definitely have mixed feelings about it. Eventually this Tori made the rounds with all my audio buddies and won the hearts of many. However, none of them have heard the UFO2 except Mark and me. Interestingly, Mark actually prefers the UFO2 over the Tori with its Klipsch Forte. But keep in mind, okay, the Tori and UFO2 are his favorite amps out of the gazillion amps he has borrowed from me. So, how do I make a video on this? If I tell people the UFO2 is better than the Tori MK5, people will call me crazy. Or they will cancel the Tori MK5 amp order and order the UFO2. Here is the thing. I always say it's so much easier to get entry-level gear to sound good than high-end gear. High-end gear, from my experience over the years, takes a bit of patience and experience to dial it in properly. However, once you get it right, it will leave entry-level audio in the dust. Get it wrong and people will think high-end audio is snake oil. My audio buddies, it took me a while, a lot of blood and sweat, well actually a lot of money, but I've gotten the Tori to sound amazing. 2 thumbs up! So today we are going to talk about it. In the interest of transparency, Decware is not paying me, nor did they tell me I can keep this amp. They did mention that I can buy it at a very small discount. The $4,000 USD Tori MK5 is a tube power amp. With volume control, it can work like an integrated amp. It is rated at 25 watt and it's a tube roller's dream because it supports 8 kinds of power tubes. This is a dual mono design and it even has 2 power switches. One for each channel. This feels more like a monoblock. Well, 2 monoblocks in one body. The unit is hand-built with point-to-point wiring and no circuit board. Now, what really stands out is it not only have a tube rectifier, but it also has a tube power regulator. Now, I love the fact there are so many tubes on it that you can decorate your Christmas tree with it. Okay, well, maybe not, but it looks really cool. Especially the OA3 regulator tubes. Man, let me show you a clip of how it looks like when I power it up. Now, if you go check on their website, they mentioned something about designing this amp with even order harmonics. You know what, really interesting and worth a read. Finally, it is made in the USA with a lifetime warranty. So, how does it sound? I'll describe it with the stock Electro Harmonics EL34 tubes, okay? Unlike the Decware UFO2, instead of a sweet, warm sound, the Tori is more on the neutral side. And that is what shocked me when I first powered it up. The top end has amazing resolution. It's detailed, refined, and it's not fatiguing. Very clean, but not clinical. The mid-range is more on the linear side. As I was telling Mr. Vintage, hey, he's my audio buddy. This sounds like a Class A single-ended amp to me. That clear and linear mid-range is usually what I hear in a single-ended amp. Bass is also linear, so there's no bass bump, no exaggeration, so it's very nuanced. Soundstage is excellent. I know we always say tube amps are airy, wide, spacious, holographic, layered, and have good depth, but this Decware, maybe because it is an all-tube design, it is a level up compared to the gazillion more affordable tube amps I've reviewed. The instrument separation is very good too. It never gets messy, no matter how complicated the track is. Dynamic is more on the polite side. This evaluation got me thinking. Mr. Kanta recently told me, he said, you know what, one thing he noticed is that as we move up the audio ladder, gear tends to sound more and more neutral. So to help me evaluate the unit, I have my audio buddy, Loic, Mr. Jazz, Mr. Quad, Mr. Vintage, Mr. Kanta, and Mark tried it at their home. Mr. Jazz, Loic, Mark, and Mr. Vintage loved it. Mr. Kanta appreciated it. And Mr. Quad did not like it. Yep, this is Thomas and Stereo. If any of my buddies don't like it, I will say it. So let's start with what you have to be careful about if you're planning to buy this unit. As you know, I like to categorize things so it is easier to understand where I'm coming from. Okay. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying things when I say there is the O-tube sound and the new tube sound. An O-tube amp with an O-tube sound would be like this vintage amp I have here. Now, if you look at it, man, the thing is almost falling apart. Every time I power it up, I am so worried that the thing will explode in my face. This vintage 2 amp has a rich, thick, and I mean like double Big Mac thick, warm mid-range. Not refined, not detailed, meh soundstage, and almost one-note bass, but I love it to death. Both the vintage amp and the double Big Mac. The warm, syrupy, sweet, thick mid-range is what tube amp is all about, and this amp has it, and it is bloody cheap. The more modern tube amps, like the Cayenne, the Woodsington, the Audio Research, and also my upcoming amp, the Galleon TS120, which will be here next week, have what I call the new tube sound. Fast, detailed, holographic, 3D, dynamic, and blah, blah, blah. The danger is some of these modern amps I've listened to, which I would not name, sounds solid state, too dynamic, not smooth enough, too fast, and so forth. The UFO2 and Tori 5 are in between the old tube sound and the new tube sound. Now the UFO2 is closer to the vintage amp with a sweet warm mid-range, while the Tori is closer to the modern amp because, it has all the characteristics of a modern amp, such as fantastic layering, great soundstage, airy, and so forth. But it does not sound totally like a modern tube amp. As Mr. Vintage said, the Decware is in a class of its own, like a Mercedes sedan, while the modern tube amps are like sports car. So one of the big things that I noticed with the Decware is that it does not have the dynamics and feel of a transistor amp. Today's modern tube amps are so fast and dynamic that it can rival solid state. But they sometimes end up sounding like solid state. One of the reasons why Mr. Quad did not like the Decware is that he finds it too soft in the dynamics. That was a deal breaker for him. Mr. Vintage told me this morning, the Decware, it'll give you enjoyment, the enjoyment of listening to music, while modern tube amps will give you excitement. Now, just to be clear, the Decware is dynamic, but just not to the point where it will knock you out. The reason why we're really picky with this amp is because it's bloody $4,000, and at this price, we are not as forgiving as when we're evaluating entry-level gear. Next, I prefer pairing it with warm sounding gear because, as I said, this amp sounds like a Class A amp and it has that linearity and mid-range clarity. I always say Class A with the wrong pairing can sound a bit lean. Sure, the mid-range has body, But with the Decware, yeah, there was some pairing where I did run into this problem. So with bass being linear, this amp is amazing for critical listening. However, if you're the type that prefers the exaggerated bass of the Wilson R8, which is a lot of fun, the Decware may not be your cup of tea. As I always say, a question of taste. Now, I did send an email to Steve at Decware sharing my observations regarding the dynamics, and this is what he wrote back. And I'll put it up here on screen. In short, you know, the amp was voiced for single driver speakers, so it's a little bit laid back. And if I wanted a bit more dynamics, then I'll have to go with their monoblocks. So now, let's move on to the positives. For those of you who have seen the Sibelius speaker video, you know, Mr. Jazz and Loic gave the combo Denafrep, Venus stack, the Decware Torii, the Sibelius, a 10 on 10. Mr. Jazz loved the airiness, the big soundstage, the clear image, and how nicely the bass was controlled. Loic called the combo a decadent sundae with hot chocolate and cherries. I guess he meant it sounded sweet. Seriously, man, that is all he gave me after spending weeks with the combo. A completely useless breakdown. Loic, man, you're fired. Mr. Vintage loved it when he used it with the 6L6 WGB tubes. Not the regular 6L6 tubes. 6L6 WGB, because the plate voltage is lower. So most amp on the market cannot support it. That is why for Mr. Vintage, man, the Tori is amazing because it does run at a lower plate voltage. So, oh, by the way, if you run at a lower plate voltage, does it mean that your tubes will last longer? If you know, put it in the comments. This is important because it means you can spend money buying expensive tubes without feeling too bad, since you know that they'll run for a long time. Now, Mr. Vintage loves the mid-range with the 6L6 WGB tubes. He was really impressed with the fantastic texture and body in the mids. As he said, for him, it is the best 20 watt you could get when compared to other contenders. Now, keep in mind, Mr. Vintage taste is, you know, he likes neutral setups. So, without a doubt, this is a dream amp for tube rolling. It is so neutral that when you change tubes, you can hear the sound characteristic of each different tubes easily. Now, remember I said to get the Tori to sound good, it took me a while, lots of blood and sweat, well, actually a lot of money, because I wanted to test it with all kind of tubes. If I don't have it, I would go buy it. So let me show you a photo of all the tubes I've tried. KT66, KT77, EL34, KT88, 6550, and I like EL34 the most. This is the first amp I've ever tried where I prefer EL34 over KT88. It was smoother and had more meat on the bone. The turning point for me, where I changed from I like this amp to I love this amp, is when I put in the electric Sophia EL34 tubes. It gave me a bit more sweetness and warmth that I felt was missing. With that simple change, it glued me to my chair listening to music until 1 AM in the morning. Now, besides the Sophia tubes, I had very good success with these Psvane EL34 PH tubes. Now, these are Holland Philips metal-based 6CA7 replicas. They were sent to me from China Hi-Fi a long time ago with the Wilson R8. Now, I never talked about it because I thought, yeah, okay, they were okay. More clarity compared to the stock tubes on the R8. But I was never like, wow, these are good. With the Tori 5, oh yeah, they got to shine. The bass is rounder, there's more authority in the presentation, and it sounded cleaner. And I went on eBay looking for it. Hey, so how much does a real new old stock cost? This Philip. It's like almost $1,000. I'm like, oh my goodness, man. I personally will choose these replica over the Electro Harmonics tubes I got from Decware. When compared to the Sophia tubes are sweeter sounding, while the Psvane has better control. Next, I paired it with many systems that work really well. Okay, we know the Sibelius works, right? So another example would be the Denafrep Venus with the vintage VTL 2.5 tube preamp, or the Doge 8, and the Harbeth M30 speakers. That combo, man, I was in audio nirvana. So, how does the $4,000 Decware Torii compare to the less expensive $1,000 UFO2? The UFO2 sounds similar to 300B tubes, smoother, sweeter sounding, and has a warmer, thicker mid-range, while the Tori sounds more like 845 tubes, more neutral, more clarity, more linear, and the vocals are more lifelike. The Tori has more attack. Any instruments that uses the upper frequency has more bite. For example, sounds like cymbals. The Tori is sharper, more detailed, and more refined. A song I sometimes use to test is this song, The First Time by Now's Lofgren. Well, anyway, test it on your system, and the opening with the Tori, there's more energy to the strings, as well as that more spacious feeling. The instruments felt more real with the Tori. Great song, by the way, and it sounded amazing on my system. When I listen to violins, there's more texture with the Tori, and you can feel the drag of the rosin on the strings. UFO2, while being smoother, you lose all that relative to the Tori. Look, UFO2 is detailed, but it is one level down compared to the Tori. This is also true in the bass region. I can pick out way easier multi-variation in the lower notes compared to the UFO2. Well, or even compared to most of the tube amps I listen to. The Tori does not have that bump, so the bass region is really nuanced. Well, the Tori is definitely faster and more exciting. Next, because the Tori mid-range is less thick, the sense of air and space is superior to the UFO2, and even superior to most tube amps I listen to. You feel like you're listening to a band in the room with the UFO2, while with the Tori, you feel like you're listening to a band in the hall. That extra level of scale, depth, and width is world class, man. Another win for the Tori over the UFO2 is when I start pushing the volume on my Harbeth 85 dB speakers. Oh yeah, that is where the Tori 25 watt comes in pretty handy. The UFO2, is 2.3 watts. Now, having said that, I had to push the volume to like 80% on both my VTL and my Tori to get normal loud volume. But there's no distortion, no strain. Heck, man, even a 2 watt UFO2 can still push the Harbeth pretty good. Now, I like the fact that both amps don't distort like most other more powerful tube amps I've tried. I mean, the 2.3 watt from the UFO2 feels more powerful than the 6 or 10 watts tube amps that I've tried. I don't know why. Now, whether you decide a UFO2 or Tori 5 will still come down to two things. First, a question of taste. Mark prefers the smoother UFO2 because smoothness and sweetness, those are his priority. While I prefer the more spacious, more lifelike, more nuanced Tori 5. The only unfortunate part is Mark never got a chance to listen to it at my place. The second thing, my concern is that for you to be able to hear the difference between the UFO2 and the Tori, you might need to have a proper setup. Think about it. If you're the type who push your speakers next to a wall, yeah, the soundstage will be limited. So either a UFO2 or Tori probably will give you a similar soundstage because your speaker positioning is your bottleneck. If you don't treat your room, you might not get that pinpoint imaging or able to listen deep into the recording, for example. So the advantages of the Tori over the UFO2 might not be as apparent in a normal room. Just something for you to think about when deciding which one to get. Now, in the comments, I am really curious, which amp would you choose, factoring in the price difference between the two? Alright, so let's wrap it up now. Now, I don't want anyone to think that the amp just sounds okay with stock tubes. No, it sounds good with stock tubes. Case in point, Mr. Jazz and Lowick loved it with stock tubes. The difference is I had a chance to compare it to the UFO2, so I was looking for that sweetness, and I found it with the Sophia tubes. I do wonder what happened if Mr. Quad and Mr. Kanta, who did not fall in love with this amp like the rest of us, if they hear it now at my place, how would they feel? For me, both Decware amps sound different enough that it is not as simple as, well, I'll buy the Tori 5 because it is the better amp. For me, it is almost like you need to buy both amps. So yeah, I know. Watching Thomas Stereo can be dangerous for your wallet. No, it's too bad that the waiting list is so long. But you know what? Remember that restaurant at Hong Kong? I chose it because the lineup was really long. Guess what? The food was really good. And it was worth the wait. Even today, after many years, I still remember. With that, I will see you next time.